Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia Spring, 1946. The war ended on paper before it ended in places like Hollow Creek. In March of 1946, newspapers reached the valley weeks late. Radios worked when they felt like it. Men returned home in groups too small to look like celebrations and too quiet to look like defeats. No banners were hung. No speeches were given. The government marked the end of the war with declarations. The valley marked it with absence. Road maintenance crews stopped coming first. Then supply schedules grew irregular. Then the county sheriff began showing up less often, explaining, politely, apologetically, that priorities had changed. No one argued. Hollow Creek had learned long ago that arguing required someone to listen. Caleb Mercer returned on a Wednesday. He didn't come back with ceremony. He didn't arrive in uniform. He came down the eastern road in a borrowed truck, dust settling behind him like a held breath. At 34 years old, he looked older than his age and younger than the years he carried. He stopped at the edge of the valley and looked down before driving the rest of the way. Nothing had changed, which meant something already had. The fields were still planted in straight rows. The sawmill still turned when there was reason to. The general store still opened on schedule, though half the shelves were empty. People moved the way they always had, measured, deliberate, conserving effort. But the old signs of oversight were gone. No federal trucks, no county inspectors, no men with clipboards pretending to take inventory. The war had pulled attention outward. When attention leaves a place long enough, the place learns to operate without it. Caleb drove past the Mercer property and continued into town. That alone was noted. He stopped at the store, paid cash for coffee he did not drink, and spoke to no one longer than necessary. People nodded. Some asked how long he'd be staying. He didn't answer. It wasn't rudeness. It was accuracy. He hadn't decided yet. Thomas Mercer arrived 2 days later. Thomas had been born 4 years after Caleb, but he had learned earlier how to speak without saying anything that could be repeated. Where Caleb absorbed silence, Thomas translated it. He shook hands. He remembered names. He asked about children who were no longer children. He noticed the missing sheriff before anyone mentioned it. "The county's stretched thin," he said casually after his third conversation. "Bound to happen." People agreed. Agreement cost nothing. Evan Mercer came last. He arrived in May, thinner than he should have been, with medals he didn't wear and opinions he hadn't learned to temper yet. At 22, he still believed in cause and consequence as separate things. He asked why the road hadn't been fixed. Someone told him the county budget was tight. He asked why no one complained. Someone else said there wasn't much use. That answer disturbed him more than the first. In 1946, the Mercer brothers did not plan to run anything. They planned to understand. Caleb visited the sawmill and counted idle machines. He spoke to the mill owner not as a superior, but as someone doing arithmetic out loud. Thomas walked the town in the evenings, listening to what people said when they believed no decisions were being made. Evan watched the store ledger when the owner wasn't looking and noticed patterns no one had bothered to hide. By summer, it was clear where the valley's vulnerabilities were. Food arrived late. Fuel arrived inconsistently. Transport depended on favors rather than schedules. None of this looked dramatic. That was the danger. Communities rarely collapse loudly. They thin. They adapt. They accept smaller expectations without announcing the adjustment. The county made its absence felt politely. Letters arrived explaining delays. A clerk stopped answering calls. When someone finally reached the sheriff, he sounded tired and grateful that no emergencies were being reported. "There's not much we can do for you folks right now," he said sincerely. Caleb Mercer believed people when they told the truth. And the truth was this: Hollow Creek had been deprioritized. Once recognized, the fact changed everything. The Mercers didn't announce help. They didn't offer protection. They did not fill the void with speeches. They filled it with logistics. Caleb made arrangements with farms outside the valley. Small agreements, personal exchanges. Thomas coordinated deliveries through routes the county no longer monitored closely. Evan insisted receipts be kept, records maintained, rules followed. "You don't need rules," someone told him. "That's when you need them most," Evan replied. The valley noticed the difference immediately. Deliveries arrived on Tuesdays instead of when they could. Fuel stopped disappearing between stops. Food distribution adjusted quietly. No one went hungry. No one felt sudden relief. Just continuity. Continuity breeds trust faster than generosity. By autumn, people were coming to the Mercer property not to ask for permission, but to ask for timing. When should we move the shipment? Who's handling the route this week? Can we count on Tuesday again? No one asked who was in charge. They asked because the answer worked. Evan disliked this development. "We should talk to the county," he said one night as they ate in silence. "Make this official." Thomas didn't look at him. "They already know," he said. Caleb said nothing. Silence in his mind was confirmation. By winter, the sheriff visited. He drank coffee at the store and spoke to Thomas privately. He thanked him for keeping things orderly. He made no threats. He asked no questions. Before leaving, he said something that would later be remembered with precision. "Don't let this become a problem." He didn't specify for whom. The Mercers understood anyway. In 1946, Hollow Creek did not fall into lawlessness. It stepped into self-regulation. And the men who made it possible did not do so by force, fear, or ambition. They did it by making absence manageable. That was the year the valley learned it could function without the law. And once a community learns that lesson, it never completely forgets it. Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia autumn, 1948. By 1948, the county had learned the valley no longer required reminders. Paperwork still existed. Letters were still stamped. Official titles were still printed beneath signatures. But none of it arrived on time, and none of it changed anything once it did. Authority had not been removed. It had been outpaced. The first visible change came with routes. Before, supplies arrived according to permission. Now, they arrived according to rhythm. Tuesday mornings became predictable. Thursday afternoons filled gaps. By Friday, nothing waited for approval. It simply moved. Caleb Mercer tracked this quietly. He never drew maps, but he remembered them. Not roads as lines, but roads as habits. He noted which paths people trusted when weather turned, which shortcuts were only used when someone didn't want to be seen, which vehicles slowed down when they thought no one was watching. Thomas handled communication. He didn't send messages. He synchronized people. A farmer knew when to harvest because his neighbor knew when transport was available. Store owners adjusted stock because Thomas mentioned offhandedly that it would be unfortunate to reorder before Thursday. Nothing sounded like instruction. Everything landed like advice. Evan watched all of it with increasing unease. "This isn't coordination," he said one night. "This is governance." Thomas poured coffee and didn't respond. Caleb waited longer before answering. When he did, his voice was flat. "Governance requires enforcement," he said. "We're just preventing friction." Evan didn't accept that distinction. In late October, the county sent an assessor. The man arrived late, apologized often, and asked for records that had already been prepared. Evan handed them over proudly. Clean ledgers, precise figures, routes documented with almost stubborn care. The assessor blinked at the organization. "Who set this up?" he thought to have asked. Evan hesitated. Thomas spoke instead. "We noticed inefficiencies." The assessor nodded. He didn't write anything down. He left after lunch, promising to follow up. No follow-up came. By winter, the valley adjusted further. Disputes were no longer taken to the sheriff's office. That would require travel, paperwork, waiting. Instead, they passed through the mercer's kitchen or Thomas's quiet walks through town. Caleb never ruled. He weighed. Thomas never judged. He reframed. Evan insisted on fairness, even when it slowed things down. People noticed which approach resolved outcomes fastest. They stopped knocking at Evan's door first. The valley didn't declare allegiance. It optimized. That was how power settled, not as dominance, but as convenience. In December, a state official scheduled a visit. The appointment was logged. The date was circled. Preparations were discussed. Then the official cancelled. "Rescheduled indefinitely," the letter "wait" said. Thomas read it twice and placed it beneath the breadbasket. "They won't come," he said calmly. "How can you be sure?" Evan asked. Thomas smiled thinly. "Because nothing is broken." That night, Caleb stood outside longer than usual, listening to the valley settle. Lights went out in sequence. No curfews existed, yet patterns held. Order had been achieved without announcement, and order, once achieved quietly, resists being reintroduced loudly. Evan understood this before the others admitted it. "We're becoming the reason they don't come," he said. Caleb didn't deny it. "We're becoming the reason nothing collapses," he corrected. In 1948, no law was violated, but authority stopped being consulted. And when authority stops being consulted long enough, it eventually notices it has been replaced. Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia summer, 1950. The car arrived just after noon, raising more dust than attention. It was black, recently washed, and unnecessary. People noticed it the way they noticed weather, by acknowledgement, not reaction. Conversations didn't stop. Doors stayed open. No one hurried. The state sent Harold Bennett, Deputy Coordinator for Regional Compliance. His title was longer than his patience, and both were already tired by the time he stepped out of the vehicle. Bennett carried a folder thick with forms that assumed resistance. He found none. Thomas Mercer greeted him near the store, hand extended, expression polite but unremarkable. The interaction did not feel like a confrontation. It felt like two men aligning schedules. "Thank you for coming all this way," Thomas said. Bennett nodded. "I won't be long." That was the first thing he got wrong. Evan accompanied them, notebook in hand, prepared to explain structures, limits, responsibilities. He had rehearsed transparency like a defense. Caleb watched from a distance. Inside the store, Bennett asked direct questions and received direct answers. Supply chains were clear. Records were maintained. Taxes were accounted for. Too well. This level of organization usually requires oversight, Bennett said, flipping through the pages. Thomas tilted his head slightly. Oversight was unavailable. That doesn't grant authority. No, Thomas agreed. It revealed necessity. Bennett frowned. He was not a man unaccustomed to resistance, but he was unused to agreement that offered no leverage. He drove through the valley that afternoon. No barricades, no guards, no signs of intimidation. Just predictability, people working, deliveries arriving, problems already solved. That was the problem. Bennett spoke with residents individually. He framed questions carefully, fishing for grievance, dependency, coercion. He found none. What he found instead was relief, not loyalty, not devotion, just relief that things worked. By evening, Bennett returned to his car with fewer answers than he'd brought. Caleb approached him for the first time. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Caleb asked. Bennett hesitated. He looked at the man, not as a subject, but as a variable he hadn't calculated for. "I was sent to assess risk," Bennett said. "And?" Caleb pressed. Bennett glanced back at the valley. "There is no risk," he said finally. "There is replacement." The word lingered between them. Replacement did not imply hostility. It implied redundancy. That night, Bennett wrote a report that avoided conclusions. He used terms like locally sustained stability and low enforcement priority. He recommended observation. Observation never came. In the weeks that followed, the valley didn't change. That, too, was noted. Evan struggled most with the visit. "They didn't stop us," he said. "They didn't even try." Thomas folded the report carefully and placed it out of sight. Stopping something requires certainty. It shouldn't exist. Caleb added, "Intervention requires disruption. They saw no benefit in introducing it." Evan stared at the ledger, at the numbers that no longer felt neutral. "So that's it?" he asked. "We just continue?" Caleb met his gaze. "There is nothing else to do," he said. "Continuity becomes expectation." By the end of 1950, Hollow Creek no longer spoke of the law as absent. It spoke of it as irrelevant. And irrelevance, once accepted, is almost impossible to reverse. Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia. Early winter, 1952. By 1952, the valley no longer spoke about stability as something fragile. It was assumed. Questions still existed, but they surfaced less often and in quieter ways. Not because people were afraid to ask them. Fear would have been easier to recognize, but because the answers were increasingly inconvenient. Silence required less work. The shift wasn't announced. It never is. It began with small omissions. Meetings stopped being scheduled. There was no longer a reason to gather everyone when outcomes could be adjusted individually. Discussions moved from tables to doorways. Decisions were framed as logistics instead of choices. Caleb noticed first. People weren't waiting for direction anymore. They were waiting for confirmation. Thomas noticed next. Disputes arrived already reduced. Both sides aware of what resolution would look like before it was spoken. His role was no longer mediation. It was affirmation. Evan noticed last. What disturbed him wasn't the efficiency. It was the absence of disagreement. He reviewed the records obsessively, searching for imbalance, for voices missing from the data. Everything was clean, too clean. When was the last time someone challenged us? he asked one evening. Thomas considered the question. Challenging implies opposition, he said. There hasn't been any. That's not reassuring, Evan replied. Caleb listened without intervening. In February, a dispute surfaced that could not be smoothed quietly. Two families claimed the same tract of land along the eastern slope. Both had documentation. Both had history. Both expected resolution. In earlier years, this would have gone to the county. It would have taken months. No one would have been satisfied. Now, both families came to the Mercers. Evan insisted on full review. He cross-checked deeds, testimonies, boundaries measured by hands that no longer trembled. Caleb listened to each side without interruption. Thomas observed who spoke first, who hesitated, who deferred. The decision, when it came, was balanced, reasonable, and final. No one argued. That was when Evan realized something had changed irreversibly. They accepted it too easily, he said afterward. That's what fairness looks like, Thomas replied. No, Evan said quietly. That's what trust looks like when it's already been transferred. The families left. The land was divided. The valley moved on. No record of the dispute was sent beyond Hollow Creek. No one thought to. By spring, silence had acquired structure. People knew what not to bring up. They avoided framing problems in ways that required moral judgment. They focused on outcomes. Efficiency replaced debate. Predictability replaced process. Caleb began turning away requests he would have accepted years earlier. You should speak to each other first, he told them. They did. And when they failed, they returned, not angry, but resigned. We tried, they would say. Silence had become permission. In June, Evan wrote a letter to the county. He did not accuse. He did not demand. He explained, carefully, precisely. He outlined the informal authority that had taken shape. He suggested reintegration, oversight, structure. The letter was returned unopened, address unknown. Evan stared at the envelope longer than necessary. Do they even exist anymore? He asked. They do, Caleb said. Just not here. The realization settled heavily. Hollow Creek was no longer waiting for governance. It had replaced it with mutual dependence and accepted outcomes. Silence was no longer absence. It was policy. Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia, late summer, 1954. The question arrived without drama. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't framed as accusation or revolt. It came the way certain realizations do, quietly, after the work was already done. Evan Mercer asked it during an ordinary evening, when there was nothing left to resolve and nowhere urgent to be. What happens, he said, if someone says no? Thomas looked up from his plate. Caleb didn't. To what? Thomas asked. To us, Evan answered. To the way things work now. The silence that followed was unfamiliar, not heavy, evaluative. Caleb finally spoke. Then they would be free to do so. Evan nodded slowly. And if that refusal disrupts the valley? That hasn't happened, Thomas said. That's not what I asked. The truth was uncomfortable because it didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It asked about limits. In the years since the war, Hollow Creek had grown stable enough to forget instability. Children learned routines they assumed had always existed. Disputes were predictable. Supplies arrived on time. No one worried about who to call when something went wrong. They already knew. Evan's concern wasn't about power. It was about inevitability. When did this stop being optional? He asked. Thomas leaned back. When people stopped bringing alternatives. Caleb's voice was lower. When refusal became less effective than participation. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. He walked the valley roads until lights went out behind him. Houses darkened in orderly sequence. The absence of fear unsettled him more than its presence ever had. In September, the refusal came. Not dramatic, not symbolic. A single supplier, new to the region, unfamiliar with patterns, declined to follow the established schedule. He insisted on routing through county channels. He cited procedure, regulation. The valley adjusted around him. Deliveries bypassed his route. Timing shifted. No one confronted him. No one warned him. Within weeks, his operation became unviable. He left without complaint, convinced the decision had been his alone. Evan watched it happen with growing clarity. No one told him no, he said to Caleb. They made no impossible. Caleb didn't deny it. Influence doesn't require confrontation, he said. Only alignment. The line had been crossed long ago. Evan now understood where it had been. In October, he made a decision of his own. He wrote again to the state, this time not as a request, but as a record. He documented systems, dependencies, names. He mailed copies to multiple offices. He did not tell his brothers. When the responses came, months later, they were careful, distant, non-committal, acknowledgement without intent. By then, the valley had moved on. Evan realized something crucial and irreversible. The system didn't persist because it was hidden. It persisted because it was preferable. In December, Evan announced he was leaving, not in protest, not in anger, just departure. I need to know what this looks like from the outside, he said. Thomas wished him well. Caleb said only, you already know. As Evan drove out of Hollow Creek for the last time, he understood what made the valley different from places that collapsed. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been enforced. Everything had simply settled. And some questions, once asked, could never again be unheard. Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia winter, 1956. After Evan left, the valley did not pause. If anything, it became quieter. There were no speeches about his departure. No explanations were offered. People noticed the absence the way they noticed weather patterns shifting slightly, without alarm, but with awareness. Caleb and Thomas did not replace him. They redistributed his role. Records were kept, but with less insistence on completeness. Decisions were still made, but fewer of them needed to be explained. The system had matured past dependence on justification. Continuity no longer required witnesses. In early February, a minor accident occurred near the Eastern Road. No injuries, property damage only. 2 years earlier, it would have initiated conversation about responsibility. Now, both parties arrived with solutions already prepared. They didn't ask who would decide. They asked when it would be finalized. Caleb handled it in minutes. The speed unsettled even him. Authority, once normalized, compresses time. Thomas noticed another shift. People had begun referencing how things are done, rather than what was agreed. Language had changed. Agreement implied choice. Process implied inevitability. We should document this, Thomas said one evening. For clarity. Caleb shook his head. Documentation invites revision. Spring came early that year. Roads thawed faster than expected. Transport increased. Outsiders passed through more often, but none stayed long. Hollow Creek functioned too smoothly to invite inspection. In April, a regional newspaper ran a brief piece on declining enforcement costs in rural areas. Hollow Creek was not mentioned. That omission mattered more than coverage ever would have. By summer, Caleb began stepping back from routine decisions. Not dramatically. He simply allowed outcomes to proceed without his confirmation. Nothing changed. That disturbed him. He had once believed his presence was central. Now he understood it had been transitional. The system no longer needed him. In August, Thomas asked him directly, "Are we still responsible?" Caleb considered the question carefully. "Responsibility implies choice," he said. "This is momentum." "What happens if we stop?" Thomas asked. Caleb looked out over the valley. "We already did." Responsibility had dissolved into structure. In November, a county officer passed through unannounced. He stopped for fuel, chatted briefly, and complimented the efficiency of the road maintenance. "Things run well here," he said casually. Thomas smiled. "They always have." The officer nodded and left. No notes were taken. By the end of 1956, Hollow Creek had reached a state that no one could pinpoint, but everyone recognized. It was no longer governed. It was no longer unguided. It simply was. And without witnesses, without dissent, without external friction, continuity became indistinguishable from permanence. Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia, autumn 1958. The record was complete by October. It had taken months to assemble, not because the information was difficult to find, but because it existed everywhere at once. Procedures lived in habits. Authority lived in timing. Influence lived in expectation rather than instruction. Thomas understood this better than anyone. He did not compile the record to expose anything. He compiled it to understand whether the system could still be named. Dates were precise. Routes were mapped. Names appeared only where necessary. There were no accusations, no conclusions, only continuity described in language that assumed neutrality. It read like a technical document. That was the problem. A system that could be documented could, in theory, be challenged. Thomas never told Caleb he was keeping it. Caleb noticed anyway. "You're writing again," Caleb said one evening. "Yes," Thomas replied, "for clarity." Clarity for whom? Thomas hesitated. For history. Caleb did not argue. He had learned that Thomas only documented things he believed were already irreversible. By November, the record no longer felt urgent. Nothing had changed to justify it. No conflicts escalated. No resistance formed. The valley continued in its quiet alignment. That was when Thomas realized the final implication. If the system functioned even while being recorded, the record itself was unnecessary. He read it one last time. Then he didn't file it. The folder stayed in the house, untouched, unsent, unreferenced. No copy was made. No backup existed. The absence of the record was cleaner than its presence. In December, Evan returned. He arrived quietly, parked along the old road, and walked the remaining distance. He looked older than his years, but steadier. Distance had not clarified things the way he had hoped. "It's still running," he said after the first evening. "Yes," Thomas replied. And no one's questioned it. Thomas shook his head. Evan looked at the valley the way someone looks at a finished structure they no longer recognize as construction. "I reported it," Evan said. "Years ago." Caleb looked at him calmly. "We know." "No one came," Evan continued. "No," Thomas said. "They didn't." Evan exhaled slowly. "Then it's done." "What is?" Thomas asked. "The moment it could have been reintroduced as choice," Evan said. That passed. He stayed only 3 days. Before leaving, Evan asked one final question, not accusatory, not hopeful. Does anyone remember how this started? Caleb answered honestly. Some do, and the rest, they remember that it works. Evan nodded. That's usually enough. When he left, the folder remained where it was. Unfiled, unneeded. By the end of 1958, Hollow Creek no longer generated records of its own structure. Not because it feared exposure, but because documentation implied contingency. And the valley no longer believed it was temporary. Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia, autumn 1962. The moment passed without ceremony. There was no announcement, no decision logged, no visible shift that could later be pointed to and named. If someone had asked when Hollow Creek became what it was, no one would have known how to answer. That was the point. In early October, Caleb Mercer died. Not suddenly, not tragically. He passed the way men like him often do, quietly, after a long usefulness, with nothing unresolved enough to require instructions. The valley adjusted immediately. Meals arrived where they were needed. Responsibilities redistributed themselves without discussion. Thomas did not assume a role because there was no role left to assume. Caleb's absence changed nothing measurable. That disturbed Evan more than anything else could have. I thought something would pause, Evan said days later. Even briefly. Thomas shook his head. Pauses imply awareness of transition. The funeral was modest. Attendance was expected, not emotional. People spoke of Caleb respectfully, but without reverence. He had not been a figurehead. He had been a function. Functions, once absorbed, do not generate nostalgia. In November, Evan asked Thomas a question he had avoided for years. If someone wanted to undo this, he said, could they? Thomas thought carefully. Undo what exactly? The way things work. Thomas considered the valley beyond the window, the even pacing, the absence of urgency, the stable quiet that no longer drew attention to itself. They would need an alternative that worked better, he said finally. And if no such alternative exists, then any attempt would feel irresponsible. Evan understood the implication. By December, Hollow Creek was no longer referenced in any county planning documents. Not deliberately excluded, simply unnecessary to include. Infrastructure budgets bypassed it. Oversight reports skipped it. The valley did not notice. Children born that year would grow up believing coordination was natural. That authority was ambient rather than assigned. They would never learn the names of men who had once mattered. They would learn patterns instead. Evan walked the roads often that winter, testing a theory. He avoided the Mercer's house. He avoided familiar paths. He introduced small delays, minor deviations, quiet refusals. The system absorbed them all. Nothing broke. When Evan left again, this time permanently, he did not announce it. There was nothing left to announce. In 1962, Hollow Creek did not cross a line. It erased one. And when lines disappear without notice, there is no longer a way back across them. Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia, spring 1960. Permanence doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, embedded in routine, passed down without instruction. By 1960, Hollow Creek no longer functioned as a system that needed explanation. It functioned as something people were born into. Children learned timing before rules. They knew when deliveries arrived without being told why. They understood which paths were reliable and which conversations ended quickly. They absorbed order the way previous generations absorbed weather. Caleb noticed this first in the schoolhouse. A teacher mentioned casually that students had begun organizing responsibilities without instruction. Tasks were completed before schedules were posted. Disputes were settled among themselves, quickly, without escalation. They don't argue, she said. They adjust. That word again, adjustment, had replaced disagreement as the valley's default response. Thomas saw it in trade. Younger residents entering business never asked permission. They asked alignment questions. How would this fit? Who would need to know? What timing made sense? No one asked who was in charge. They asked how things worked. Caleb felt the shift as distance. His presence no longer shaped outcomes. His absence no longer disrupted them. Authority had moved past individuals and into expectation. He had become historical while still alive. In May, a neighboring town held an election. The event was minor, poorly attended, and inconclusive. When the results were announced, nothing changed. Hollow Creek took note without interest. That summer, a family moved into the valley. Outsiders, not investigators, just people seeking quiet. They were welcomed without ceremony. No explanations were offered. Within weeks, they had adapted. They adjusted their work to the valley's rhythms. They stopped contacting the county. They learned who to ask questions of. Not because they were told to, but because answers arrived faster that way. Evan watched this from a distance. He had returned earlier in the year, staying on the periphery, observing rather than participating. "It's inherited," he said one evening, "not enforced." Thomas agreed. "That makes it durable." Evan frowned. "That makes it invisible." Caleb listened. He had lived long enough to know that invisibility was the most effective form of permanence. In August, Caleb fell ill. Nothing serious at first. Fatigue, moments of stillness that lingered longer than usual. The valley noticed, not with alarm, but with recalibration. Decisions continued. Thomas handled nothing differently. That was when Caleb understood the final shape of what they had built. It would outlive them without effort. Late one night, Caleb spoke for longer than usual. "We didn't create this," he said. "We translated something that already wanted to exist." "And now?" Evan asked. "Now it belongs to the Kia'a Valley," Caleb replied. "Not to us." Thomas remained silent. He had already accepted it. By the end of 1960, Hollow Creek no longer marked changes in authority. There was no longer a transition point to remember. Permanence had been inherited. And once inherited, it no longer required justification. Hollow Creek Valley, West Virginia, late spring 1965. By 1965, it was difficult to explain Hollow Creek to anyone who hadn't grown up there. Not because it was hidden, but because nothing about it announced itself as unusual. The roads were passable, businesses functioned, disputes were rare and brief. There were no visible hierarchies, no public enforcers, no rituals of power. Things happened when they needed to happen. People adjusted before problems solidified. From the outside, it looked peaceful. From the inside, it felt complete. Thomas Mercer lived quietly now. He did not withdraw, but he no longer coordinated. Others filled the gaps without noticing they had done so. Timing persisted, expectations held. Occasionally, an official letter arrived from the county. generic notices, budget projections, invitations to meetings that no one attended. They were read, noted, and set aside. No decisions depended on them. Children born after 1950 reached adulthood without ever asking who was responsible for keeping things orderly. Responsibility was diffuse, embedded, carried collectively, without attribution. That made it resilient. A visiting sociologist passed through in June. He stayed a week, asked thoughtful questions, took careful notes. He concluded that Hollow Creek benefited from high social cohesion and shared informal norms. He left satisfied. The explanation was sufficient, even if incomplete. That summer, Thomas walked the valley one evening, as he had many times before. He saw familiar patterns continuing without effort. The system he had once helped articulate no longer resembled design. It resembled environment. He realized then that the valley no longer needed memory to persist. No one spoke of Caleb. No one spoke of Evan. No one spoke of beginnings. The present operated independently of its origins. That was the final outcome. Not control, not dominance, not rebellion. Just continuity, so seamless it erased the need for authority altogether. If someone were to arrive now and ask who governed Hollow Creek, they would receive polite confusion in response. The question wouldn't offend anyone. It would simply feel outdated, because authority, once fully absorbed, doesn't look like power. It looks like the way things are. And the most enduring systems are not the ones enforced, recorded, or defended, but the ones no one thinks to challenge anymore. Hollow Creek was never conquered. It was never taken, overthrown, or claimed. It simply learned how to function without being asked. No one remembers the exact moment it happened. There was no final decision, no last meeting, no visible shift anyone could point to and say, "This is where it changed." That's how it lasts. Because systems that announce themselves invite challenge. But systems that feel natural don't. And if this story feels unsettling, it isn't because of what anyone did. It's because of what everyone accepted. Because somewhere between convenience and silence, authority stopped needing a name. The valley didn't reject the law. It just outgrew it. And the question this leaves us with isn't about Hollow Creek. It's about how many places look peaceful, not because nothing is wrong, but because no one is asking anymore. The story doesn't end here. It never really does.